Ever been, scrolling online and you just stop?
Mm.
You see this incredible piece of AI art, or maybe hear a song that sounds, well, almost too perfect.
Yeah.
And you think, hang on, where did that actually come from?
Yeah, and is it even legal? How is it made?
That's what we're diving into today, this really complex relationship between how AI is trained and copyright law.
And the sources we're looking at today, they're not pulling any punches. They have a really strong, kind of provocative take on it all.
They really do. So our mission today, yours and ours, is to get into the core of their argument. Is training AI on copyrighted stuff fundamentally different from how humans learn and get inspired?
Right. We'll unpack why they say, no, it's not different, and then look at all the reasons people push back against that idea.
It's going to be direct, definitely no holds barred. All right, let's get into it.
Okay, so the main thrust, like you said, is this comparison. AI learning versus human learning.
How are they similar, according to these sources?
Well, the argument is that both processes involve absorbing existing information. We humans, we read, we listen, we watch. Tons of copyrighted material, usually.
Right, we soak it all in.
And we internalize patterns, styles, techniques. Then we use all that stored up stuff as, like, the raw material for our own new creations.
Okay, so that's the human side. How does AI fit that model?
The sources argue it's functionally very similar. AI gets fed huge data sets, often including copyrighted works, and it learns to spot the underlying structures, the relationships between things.
And then it uses those learned patterns to generate something new.
Exactly. So the big question they pose is, if a human painter studies, say, Van Gogh and gets inspired, that's not infringement. So why, they ask, is it infringement when an AI learns from Van Gogh's paintings?
That really does make you stop and think, doesn't it? It
Wow.
challenges how we usually view creativity.
It definitely does. And they know people disagree, so they tackle the counter-arguments head on.
Okay, like what? What's the first big one?
Intent and agency. The idea that humans have consciousness, we mean to create, we have intentions. AI, on the other hand, is just, well, a tool. Statistics, algorithms, no real understanding.
The ghost of the machine argument, sort of.
Mm-hmm.
But the sources push back on that.
Oh, strongly. They argue that copyright law fundamentally cares about the output, the thing that's made, not the creator's internal state, whether it's human consciousness or lines of code.
So it doesn't matter how it was made, just what was made.
That's the gist. They even bring up this term, the homunculus fallacy.
Okay, what's that?
It's this idea that we imagine a little person inside our head directing everything consciously. The sources suggest, maybe human creativity isn't always that deliberate either. Sometimes it just flows.
Huh. So maybe we're applying a standard based on a possibly flawed view of human creativity.
That's what they imply. They think basing the legal distinction on this somewhat fuzzy idea of human consciousness is maybe arbitrary. It doesn't quite fit the original point of copyright.
Okay, what other counter-arguments do they address?
The scale issue and direct replication. People worry AI can just perfectly memorize and spit out copies of its training data.
Which sounds pretty bad, obviously. It's stealing.
Right. But the sources argue this is often a misunderstanding of how modern AIs actually work. They're not usually storing perfect copies.
So what are they doing?
They're statistically approximating patterns. It's more like learning a style than memorizing every single brushstroke or word.
Ah.
And they say exact replication, when it happens, is usually seen as a bug, a flaw in the model, not the intended function. They contrast that with humans who intentionally plagiarize.
Which does happen.
Absolutely. And this leads them to point out what they call a double standard.
How so?
Well, think about fan fiction or someone doing a cover song, often heavily inspired by copyrighted work, right? But we tend to see it as transformative, creative.
Yeah, usually.
But if an AI generates something that mimics a style very closely, the immediate reaction is often theft. They call this an aesthetic bias, judging it differently just because an AI made it.
Interesting. Okay, what about the money side? The economic impact. People worry AI will replace human artists, take their jobs?
That's a huge concern, and the sources acknowledge it. But then they bring up history.
Like what?
Like photography versus painting. When photography arrived, painters were worried. They thought it would kill their profession.
The new technology will destroy us argument. It's an old one.
It is. And the sources argue copyright wasn't actually designed to protect specific jobs or freeze markets in time. Its goal was supposedly to incentivize new creation overall.
So disrupting existing markets isn't necessarily against the spirit of copyright, in their view.
Not inherently, no. They even add a slightly provocative point. If an AI can perfectly copy a human style,
Yeah.
maybe that style itself isn't unique enough to warrant copyright protection in the first place. Remember, copyright protects specific expressions, not general styles or ideas.
Wow, okay, that's a pretty critical take. Which actually leads into their next big point, right? Their view on copyright law itself.
Yes, this is where they really ramp it up. They call the current state of copyright. Well, the term they use is corrupt nonsense.
Whoa. Okay. Why such strong language?
They argue it's strayed miles away from its original purpose.
Which was?
To promote the progress of science and useful arts. Basically, give creators a limited time monopoly as an incentive, but balance that with public access to knowledge and culture.
And they think it's out of balance now.
Wildly out of balance. They point to copyright terms constantly getting longer life, plus 70 years or 95 years for corporations.
Right, the Mickey Mouse Protection Act stuff.
Exactly. They argue this massively benefits big companies holding on to old catalogs and starves the public domain, that pool of works everyone should be free to use and build on.
And it's not just the length, is it?
No, they also criticize how copyright is used, or, as they put it, weaponized. Think aggressive DMCA takedowns, restrictive digital rights management, or DRM.
Stuff that stops you copying a file or sharing something.
Right. They argue this is often more about corporations protecting profits and stifling competition, maybe even stifling new forms of creativity than actually encouraging new art.
So the system itself is part of the problem, not just how AI interacts with it.
That's a core part of their argument. They feel the system is broken, especially for the digital age, and that impacts everything, including the AI debate.
Okay, so we've heard the case for treating AI learning like human learning and the critique of copyright itself. Let's dig deeper into how they specifically rebut those counter-arguments we mentioned earlier.
Sure. So the second source really focuses on this. Take the intent and agency point. Again, the idea that humans are special because we're conscious creators.
Yeah.
They basically call that an appeal to mysticism. They doubled down on the idea that copyright should look at the output the work created, not try to peer into the mind of the creator, human, or AI.
So stop focusing on whether the creator has a soul, basically.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
And on the replication at scale, worry. They reiterate that claiming AI just copies wholesale is a misrepresentation. Modern models synthesize patterns.
Right, the style versus specifics thing.
Exactly. And they emphasize that the scale of learning shouldn't matter legally if the final output is genuinely new and transformative. Why limit AI's learning capacity if we don't limit humans? That's the double standard again.
Okay, and the economic argument, that AI hurts artists' markets.
They push back hard here, too. They say, look, copyright was never a job guarantee program for artists. Technologies change, markets shift.
That's a tough pill to swallow for creators, though.
Absolutely. But their point is that demanding AI only learn from public domain or specially licensed data holds AI to a much, much higher standard than any human artist has ever been held to.
Because human artists learn from everything, copyrighted or not, without asking.
Precisely. You read a book, hear a song, see a painting, you learn, you're inspired. You don't get a license for that internal learning process.
And what about the argument that copyright terms keep getting longer to encourage innovation?
They call that out as well. They argue there's little evidence these extensions actually do spur more creativity. They see it more as benefiting existing rights holders.
And they mention hypocrisy.
Yeah, they point out that many large media companies built their own empires by using works from the public domain.
Like Disney using old fairy tales.
Exactly. And now, those same companies lobby for the strictest possible controls. Their core message comes back. Humans don't need consent to learn, so why mandate it for AI?
What about the fear of big tech? That these powerful AI companies will just dominate everything?
They acknowledge that concern, but frame it differently. They say the problem isn't AI technology itself, it's the existing issue of corporate power and influence shaping laws, including copyright law.
So blaming the tool, not the user, or maybe the rule maker.
Something like that. They even suggest AI could empower smaller creators, giving them tools to compete against the big players, if the legal framework allowed it.
Interesting twist. And lastly, the point about fair use being too vague for AI.
They argue it's not as vague as some claim. They point to cases like the Google Books project.
Where Google scanned millions of books for searching.
Right. Courts generally found that using copyrighted works for a non-expressive, transformative purpose, like creating a searchable index, could be fair use. They argue AI training is similar. It uses the data to learn patterns, not to reproduce the original expression directly.
So the legal precedent might already be there, they think.
That's their position. They believe training AI models fits within a reasonable interpretation of transformative fair use.
Wow. So putting it all together, the picture they paint is pretty damning of the current situation.
Right. It really is. They see the resistance to AI training as driven by several things. One, they call anthropocentric bias, just unfairly favoring humans because we're human.
Okay.
Another is nostalgia, a longing for older ways of doing things, even if they don't fit the current reality. And maybe the biggest driver, corporate protectionism, protecting existing business models.
It definitely forces you to ask some big questions. Like, what is creativity if an AI can make something amazing?
Does the origin matter more than the quality of the work itself?
And fundamentally, who is copyright for? Is it helping creators? The public? Tech companies? Or, as these sources seem to suggest, maybe it's currently failing all three in different ways.
They certainly argue for change. They touch briefly on potential reforms.
Such as?
Things like, well, significantly shorter copyright terms, expanding fair use explicitly to cover things like AI training, maybe even compulsory licensing.
What's that exactly?
Like AI companies would pay a standard fee into a pool to get a license to use copyrighted works for training rather than negotiating individually, sort of like how radio stations pay for music.
Okay, that's one approach.
Yeah.
Anything more? Radical.
They hint at bigger ideas, maybe something like universal basic income, specifically for artists if AI does dramatically change the creative economy, or fostering more open source creative ecosystems.
Where sharing and building on each other's work is the norm, not tight ownership.
Exactly. Less focus on strict control, more on collaboration and attribution.
So wrapping up their core argument, what's the final takeaway?
It's really a deep frustration with copyright in the 21st century. They believe that treating AI learning differently from human learning lacks logical consistency.
And that this inconsistency stems from those biases, human-centric thinking, nostalgia, corporate interests.
Right. Not from sound legal or ethical reasoning. Their ultimate call seems to be for reform that gets back to basics. Limit terms, reduce corporate capture of the law, and maybe try to separate art from pure profit-seeking.
It's a powerful perspective. Whether you agree with it all or not, it definitely challenges the status quo.
Absolutely. So we've really dug into these sources that argue AI training is fundamentally just learning, like humans do, and that the real problem might be our outdated copyright system.
Which leads us to the final thought for you, our listener. After hearing all this, considering these arguments, what do you think? What's the fairest way forward? How do we balance protecting creators with fostering innovation and ensuring everyone has access to culture, especially now, in this world increasingly shaped by AI?
It's a huge question, and there aren't easy answers.
Definitely not. We hope this deep dive gave you plenty to think about, maybe even made you question some of your own assumptions on creativity, learning, and who owns ideas. Thanks for joining us.